When we think of Marcus Aurelius, we picture the philosopher king, the last of the five good emperors, writing his timeless guide to Stoic wisdom. But for most of his reign, he wasn't in some grand Roman palace thinking about virtue. No, he was in a muddy tent on the frozen Danube, commanding one of the largest armies the empire had ever seen. This is the incredible story of how a man who preached inner peace was forced to wage a brutal, decade-long war for the very survival of Rome. For Marcus, this wasn't some kind of abstract metaphor. You've got to understand, he wrote these exact words from his campaign tent at a fortress called Carnuntum, right on the edge of the known world. For him, life was literally warfare, and his home had become a foreign land, deep inside enemy territory. And that's the central paradox of his entire life, isn't it? We're talking about roughly 140,000 men under his direct command. This wasn't just some philosophical exercise. This was the harsh, grinding reality of an empire pushed right to the brink. So you have to be asking, how on earth did this happen? To really get the war, first we have to understand the man and the surprisingly peaceful world he was born into, an era that was just about to be completely shattered. It's like you're looking at two different people in the same body. On one hand, you've got Marcus the Stoic, the guy who taught that we should accept what we can't change. But on the other hand, you have Marcus the commander-in-chief, whose entire job was to violently change a disastrous situation. And he wasn't phoning it in from Rome. He was right there, on the ground, freezing through those harsh winters with his soldiers. So that long peace, that golden age of the Antonine dynasty, it wasn't just broken by one crisis. It was hit by a perfect storm. Two massive disasters that struck at the exact same time and brought the Roman Empire to its knees. The empire was basically caught in a deadly vice. As soldiers were coming back from a war in the east, they brought something terrible with them, a devastating plague. And at that exact moment of weakness, the tribes along the Danube frontier saw their chance, and they decided to strike. It's hard to even wrap your head around the scale of this plague. Modern historians figure the Antonine Plague, which was probably smallpox, wiped out somewhere between 10 to 20% of the entire empire's population. Just try to imagine the chaos, the fear, the complete breakdown of society. And this is where the two crises just tragically crashed into each other. The plague didn't just kill civilians, it tore through the army's ranks. So right when the barbarian threat was at its absolute peak, Rome's main defense force was critically undermanned and just reeling from disease. So, with the legions that weak, the frontier, a border that had held for centuries, was about to snap. And when it did, the result was a catastrophe that Rome hadn't seen in generations. Okay, first, let's just be clear about what the Roman frontier, the limes, actually was. It wasn't some giant wall like in Game of Thrones. Think of it more like a sophisticated security system, with forts and watchtowers designed to control who came in and out and to stop small-scale raids. It was never, ever meant to stop a massive, coordinated invasion. And in 170 AD, that system completely failed. A huge coalition of tribes, led by the Marcomanni and Quadi, just smashed across the Danube. They wiped out a Roman army of 20,000 men and then just poured into northern Italy. For the first time in almost 300 years, a foreign army was on Italian soil, and they were laying siege to the city of Aquileia. The psychological shock was just immense. This wasn't supposed to happen, ever. The panic got so bad that Marcus was forced into these incredibly desperate measures, basically recruiting anyone who could hold a spear, slaves, gladiators, even criminals, just to form a line of defense and push the invaders out. So, having just barely saved Italy, Marcus now knew he had to go on the offensive. And it's right here, in the brutal years of his counterattack, that we see this incredible contrast between the grim reality of war and the emperor's deep, inner philosophical life. Let's be real about Roman warfare. It was not glorious. The carvings on Marcus's column back in Rome, they show you the grim truth. Villages being torched, prisoners being executed, a systematic campaign of total destruction deep inside barbarian lands. This was a brutal, ugly, grinding war of attrition. And yet, in the middle of all of that bloodshed and misery, he wrote this. Surrounded by the absolute horrors of war, Marcus turned inward. He was using his Stoic philosophy not as some kind of escape, but as a practical tool to just endure it all and hold on to his humanity. There was one campaign in particular that pushed his men to the absolute breaking point. Picture this. It's the middle of summer, deep in enemy territory. An entire Roman legion gets surrounded, cut off from water, and is literally being left to die of thirst. How do you possibly come back from that? Well, the answer came, of all places, from the sky.
in what history now calls the miracle of the rain. Just as the enemy was closing in for the kill, the heavens opened up. A sudden, violent thunderstorm just drenched the desperate Romans, gave them water, and threw the enemy into total confusion.
The historian Cassius Dio gives us this unbelievably dramatic account of it. He claims that lightning was striking the barbarian ranks at the same time as the downpour. So for the Romans, it was life-saving water, but for their enemies, it was like a fiery hell. Now, whether it was a real miracle or just a freak storm, it was a massive turning point for Roman morale. So after years and years of this brutal fighting, Marcus Aurelius finally had victory in his grasp. But history, and well, his own son, had very different plans. It is so crucial to understand what Marcus's endgame was here. He wasn't just trying to push the tribes back across the river. His grand plan was to annex their lands completely, to create 2 brand new Roman provinces north of the Danube. This would have been a permanent buffer zone, designed to end the threat for good. And he was right on the verge of making it happen, when, in 180 AD, at the military camp of Vindobona, which is now modern-day Vienna, the emperor got sick and died. He was likely a final victim of the very same plague that had started this whole nightmare. This right here, this was the critical moment. Marcus's son, Comnenus, was now the emperor, and he had absolutely no interest in his father's long, grueling war. Instead of finishing the job, he almost immediately negotiated a quick peace, abandoned all that hard-won territory, and pulled the legions right back to the Danube. So why does all this matter? Well, because for a lot of historians, this moment is the real end of the Pax Romana, the famous Roman peace. These wars, and the decisions made right after, they exposed these deep cracks in the empire's foundation and really set the stage for all the chaos and civil war that would follow, what we now call the crisis of the 3rd century. So in the end, Rome survived the greatest test it had faced in a generation, but just barely. And that hard-won victory was completely thrown away. It really leaves us with this huge question. By choosing a quick and easy peace over his father's difficult, permanent solution, did Commodus ultimately sow the seeds for the long, slow decline of the Roman Empire?